Ladies and gentlemen, namaskar. Welcome to the 15th edition of Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India. We are at Bank of Baroda, Mughal tent. We are delighted to introduce We Are in This Together, the urgency of borrowed time. This session is presented by United Nations of India. Lakshmi Puri, former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and former Deputy Executive Director of UN Women, has worked extensively in bilateral and multilateral diplomacy, negotiation, and as an advocate for human rights and humanitarian action, sustainable development, climate change, gender equality, peace and security. Shombi Sharp, United Nations Resident Coordinator in India, an expert in sustainable development, is working towards the country's COVID-19 response plans and alignment with the UN's sustainable development goals. His Excellency Hans Jacob Frydenlund is the Norwegian Ambassador to India and has closely been involved with the focus on clean and renewable energy. In conversation with Navdeep Suri, the three experts discuss the importance of multilateralism in structural climate change, a common struggle that cannot be dealt with asymmetrical attention. Welcome all four of them on stage.
Welcome to my wonderful panelists for this session. The headline said it all, the urgency of borrowed time, and we're all in it together. The recent release of the IPCC report is scary. It suggests that even 1.5 degree is a target slipping out of our hands. Irreversible changes are taking place. We are heading closer to that tipping point that scientists have been warning us for decades now. And I think finally, the number of climate skeptics is diminishing, particularly after one eminent occupant of the White House left. The subject that we are dealing with today is of real importance to every one of us. And because it is in the context of multilateralism, and we've had the COP26 summit in Glasgow in December. So the first thought that comes to my mind from Ambassador Sharp for you is, was COP26 a cop-out in terms of the expectations that people had of it? Have we made some progress? Is multilateralism working in terms of our collective efforts to address the real urgent challenge of climate change?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador, and great to be here on behalf of the United Nations country team in India. And I think that, you know, as you've rightly noted, I mean, we had COP26, we had the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, launched just most recent working group reports last month. And I think it's really been a frightening, well, we can't say warning anymore, because as you mentioned, it's happening today. This issue is absolutely real. And I think I would start, I'm not going to say it's a cop-out. I think it did not achieve anywhere near what it could have achieved, but it did have some very important achievements. And India did have an important role in that as well. I'll come back to that just in a minute. But I wanted to start by dating myself. I graduated high school in 1988. And this is an important number for several reasons. Nothing about me, but since 1988, and this is the frightening aspect of this nonlinear change. This is what people, I think, don't understand, that the increase in temperatures has followed a curve that looks exactly like the steepest Himalayan peak. It's going straight up. So between 1988, the year I graduated high school, I'm not that old, and now the amount of carbon in the atmosphere has doubled in just that amount of time. Can you imagine what the world will look like when those kids who are graduating high school now get to my age, and the number of hottest years in the world? You know, in one sense, it makes it easy. If someone asks you, when are the hottest years on record? All you have to say is, well, you want to know last 5 hottest years? Last 5 years. Last 7? Last 7 years. Last 20? Pretty much the last 20 years. So we're in the middle of an absolute crisis. Already half of the world's population are facing severe water shortages, at least during parts of the year, already half. So that's one, that urgency. I think the second message is about the importance, this links to the question of multilateralism. So again, it can be glass half full, half empty. How do you look at it? But it is so vitally important that we have the COP process, that we have the multilateral discussions on this, the United Nations systems, because at least we have now come to a consensus of what is happening and what needs to be done about it. We have all the countries in the world setting targets. The real question is, are they implementing those targets? Are they fulfilling those targets? And can we make those targets more ambitious? This is the key. At least we got net zero commitments as a consensus from COP26, India included. We have countries like India, which is so important for the world, for the Sustainable Development Goals, accounting for maybe 40, 50% of all of the SDGs depend on actions taken here in India. So a 50% commitment to renewable energy mix by 2030, this is very, very important. All countries can do better, but this is a vitally important step that we've made in that direction.
And you make a very valid point about India's criticality in the challenge of addressing climate change. Ambassador Lakshmi Puri, you've been attending COP summits for almost a decade, I think, 10 or 11 that you've attended. Now, in the run-up to the last COP, there was a lot of discussion within India on what Ambassador Sharp mentioned about net zero. Should India sign up for net zero? If so, when? Does it mean we are simply kicking the can down the road and not addressing issues that are of much more urgent need? And I know that when Prime Minister went and announced against the advice of skeptics within and outside government about the net zero, there was a fair amount of discussion on it, that are we ceding some of our space for development by signing up for net zero commitment? So I wanted to hear your perspective on this.
Thank you, Navdeep. I think the good news is that you have a Prime Minister of India who is a believer in climate action. He has, whether it was Paris, that was a landmark commitment that was made at that time. And according to the Natural Resources Defense Council, we are apparently ahead. We are going to meet the targets that were set of 40% of renewables and of 30 to 35% of reducing emissions intensity and carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons ahead of time. And then in Glasgow, as you rightly said, no one, like him, understands the immediacy of the impact that climate change is having on India and its people and their lives.
it's impacting us every day. So he has been again, he advanced, he raised the bar of commitments at Glasgow. And he went and said that he would increase the non-fossil fuel capacity to 500 gigawatts by 2030, 50% of the energy from renewables by 2030, as was mentioned, carbon emission reduction by 1 billion tons, and carbon intensity by 45%. And as you said, net zero by 2070. So, of course, all of this requires our going on a trajectory which is unprecedented in history. We will, as he explained at Glasgow, we will have, as India, to undertake the economic transformation process alongside the green transformation process, lifting millions of people out of poverty, meeting the unmet needs, the aspirational economy, then also, in the 5 sectors that matter, at the same time, bringing about a green transformation there, that is power, industry, agriculture, energy, power I've already covered, and very important, construction and transport. So these sectors, there will have to be a major green transformation. And the idea is that it should be seen and done in a way that it becomes a win-win and not a trade-off. So I think that is what is very much the intention, but the challenge as well, because no country in the world in its development trajectory has tried to do it together. And we have that ambition of reaching that green frontier, leapfrogging into the green frontier. But of course, as I hope we will be able to also discuss, how can India, what will it take for India to reach that green frontier, attempt these 2 transformations together, and what does it take from the world to help?
So, absolutely, and that is my going to be my question to Ambassador Frydenlund, that green transitions are essential. It's a bit of a motherhood and apple pie statement. Everybody is for it. Who pays for it? Currently, the global carbon space, if we see, 25% is occupied by the US, 21% by the European Union, another 13% by China. And India has a little 3% share in that. One of the disappointments from COP26, I thought, was this commitment to come forth with a $100 billion fund to enable those transitions. And, it's bad enough that since Paris and before, those commitments haven't been met. But then you see a number of 1.3 or $1.4 trillion that have been spent on COVID, to combat COVID. Now, surely the resources are available, but the political will isn't. So countries like yours, where do they come in? Are you an advocate for more generous climate finance and using the political will of Europe to make it happen?
Well, first, you're asking the wrong person, because Norway, together with Sweden and Germany, are the 3 countries who fulfill their financing commitments. And we have to say that
We're the good guys.
We're the good guys, exactly. And as was pointed out, and it's important, if we don't succeed in India, we will not succeed. And that is a basic tenet of my country's cooperation with India. We're focusing on climate, renewable energy, environment, and ocean. And here is, when it comes to the double challenges that Mrs. Puri pointed out, is one of the advantages of India. It also has the size and intellectual capital to be able to find the affordable technologies that we need. But one thing is the additional financing. This was also happening through ordinary financing, which is from all of us. And that will bring me to your point about the multilateral system. It is always disappointing, but we needed to have actually to get a common minimal standard that we can measure us against. And it's luckily, unfortunately, just now we're starting to realize the problem because it bites. We see coastal region having problems. Where I live, actually, we used to go out fishing. The fish disappears because of climate. We see that that we need to look at seasons in a completely new way, so it gets directly to us. But at the same time, there's a hard decision to make because we need to wean ourselves off energy, not just any energy. Because if we're not more energy efficient, we will need both types. So, and in that context, multilateral goals is a way also to explain to the voters, to the public in our countries. Yes, we need to do some hard choices, and but we're not alone. Because if people say it's just us, then we get a free rider problem. Others are then moving away. In our case, we have abundant renewable energy. So say, no, it's no problem. Well, the problem is that people is burning our oil and gas, which is true, but it's not entirely sympathetic to argue that way. So we need then multilateral systems to avoid the free rider problem. And the last point there is we need to have this commitment so people know that they can invest in we have long-term commitments, which makes it possible to invest. Because if you're going to build a new solar plant or a new coal-power plant, it has enormous costs, which has to be discounted in 20, 30 years. So you will, if you don't know, if you think you can get away with the carbon emissions, you may build a coal plant. If you know in 5 years' time, you will not, it will not be able to run, you will not invest, and you'll invest in solar. So we need those commitments and we need those goals to measure ourselves against. Thank you.
We need to have measurable goals, but we also want to have binding commitments. But that binding commitment doesn't seem to apply to making the dollars available to make those transitions. And there seems to be no penalty for having failed to meet commitments COP after COP after COP. And even today, when we are talking about the $100 billion, we're also talking about, some of it might be loans. And what does that do to indebted countries which are already struggling from the impact of COVID? How do they meet repayment commitments? So, Ambassador Sharp, what does the UN try to do on climate justice? Climate change is real, but climate justice is equally real. How do you meet the needs of developing countries, enable them to make the transition, which is vital?
Thank you. Yeah, this is an absolutely important point. The whole issue of climate justice, and again, India has been a leader advocating together with and on behalf of developing countries, lower and middle income countries, in this sense, because I think, we easily lose sight of, given the sort of democratic, let's say, structure of the United Nations and of international geopolitics, we look at countries equally, and that's rightly so. But it's vitally important when we look at development and right to development, we look at the per capita angle. That's the one that matters. So if you look at per capita, I mean, you can look at India and say, okay, it's like seventh, maybe globally in terms of contributing now. But if you look at per capita, you realize that the United States, my home country, is emitting 800% more per person global emissions. And this is something that is important to understand in terms of, as you said, who has a claim to the remaining carbon space that's there. That's really important. So climate justice and understanding. So one is who needs to contribute more. Everybody needs to contribute. We've gone past that point where it's saying just high income countries, it's your problem you created, you need to deal with it. No, everybody needs to make their own differentiated, let's say, contributions. But we also need to recognize that different countries are going to face the burden, are already facing the burden to different degrees. And India is among those countries who are the most vulnerable to the impacts we're talking about, losing villages and coastal areas, being vulnerable to cyclones, water loss, all of these issues. Here, it's important, we are promoting, advocating that countries need to meet the 100 billion a year target. I think what I've seen is we're at something 70 something billion a year, which is itself not enough. And that 100 billion probably now is already, a bit low. A lot of that does come in the forms of loans, of things. Sometimes it's actually development assistance that's a bit repackaged. It's not necessarily new and additional. So we're holding countries accountable to those commitments. That's one. And we are advocating very aggressively that while mitigation, reducing our contribution to climate change is vitally important, we have to also see adaptation, strengthening resilience of communities to the impacts, they are here. This since 1988, as I mentioned, this 1.5 trillion tons in the atmosphere, that is here to stay no matter what we do today for hundreds of years. So no matter what we do, people are going to be facing the consequences. And so, for example, also India is leading in efforts to increase resilient infrastructure for communities who are vulnerable to climate change. We need to partner with the private sector. There's huge, already Indian companies are big ones, Tata and others are Mahindra, making big contributions in this space. But we need to bring along the massive potential of the middle range of Indian companies in terms of mitigation and adaptation.
And at COP26, Ambassador Puri, India and China got blamed because of the language that was being worked out on coal. Was it phase out or phase down? And there was intense debate. And the amazing thing is, a narrative was created at the end of COP26 that we were the bad guys who were unwilling to phase out coal. And I want to say that at the first sign of an natural gas shortage in Europe, there is talk of Germany restarting its coal-fired stations. Mm-hmm. How do we address the hypocrisy of climate change?
Absolutely. You are you put the hit the nail on the head, because if you look at getting to zero, forget about whether it is phase out, phase down. The question is, there is a cost. There is a cost if you work backwards. In the 20s, there have been some estimations done. In the 2020s, you're going to need $20 to $30 billion per year incrementally for India to keep meeting that target of getting to zero. By the 2030s, you're going to need $100 billion per year. So in fact, when Prime Minister spoke at Glasgow, he talked about not 100 million, but he said 1 trillion is the requirement for climate finance, for just transition for developing countries. And what does just transition mean? It means that you are able to make a green transformation, but you're also simultaneously able to create the social capital and the economic capital that is so essential, and which you need to make up. Developing countries, including like India, need to make up that gap that they have, the deficit they have. So that's the financial deficit. Let me also say that there is the big other question which is there, which is the technology gap. And there, for example, in India's case, what we need are 3 at least 3 critical technologies. And true, it's both public sector and private sector, but it has to be low cost. It has to be through foreign direct investment and creation here of enterprises and industries. But these technologies relate to electrical vehicles, advanced battery chemistry for both cars and grids, and then carbon capture technology and the green hydrogen technology. Government of India has already announced that policy, and there is really very urgent need for the developed countries who have these technologies to make them available in different ways. And I think Government of India has, in fact, started that whole process of green hydrogen collaboration, and that's something that is already ongoing.
I can see that Ambassador Frydenlund is dying to say something, something on that. So I'll let you say what is topmost of your mind, but I also will then come to another point. Please go ahead.
But just an invitation, because here we're really seeing off this in the same sheet. And when it comes to green hydrogen, and when it comes to it was green hydrogen. So, sorry, I had the curtain. When it comes to electric vehicles, Norway is actually the most the market where you have the most penetration of electric vehicles. So I tweeted back to Mr. Kant inviting for actually Indian cars. And when it comes to the other areas, actually it's where we do have technology, we do have the expertise, and we do have the finance, and that's in the forefront of our cooperation. It means that there's a huge perspectives. We are in the when it comes to the financing, and I don't think you should construct any opposition here, because all the three of us, we will go together and say we need to have more financing. But the way that will happen, that will be in many different ways. And as the financing requirements are constructed, it's one of the problems is that you have a big figure, and then you can calculate what the different countries should contribute. But as now, Norway is doubling its contribution, but that will help someone else off the hook if we don't increase the general number. Coming back to the importance of multilateral actions and how we formulate the goals. Thank you.
So, the theme today, and I want to come back to that, is we're all in it together. And it's not just about India, but Africa in particular. And India does often take up the position of speaking on behalf of our friends in Africa on some of these issues. What Ambassador Sharp mentioned, that if there's already 1.5 trillion tons in the atmosphere, a certain amount of damage is irreversible. Take the case of a poor country like Madagascar, which has been hit by half a dozen cyclones in quick succession after facing droughts. And so suddenly there's a food security issue. So Madagascar, which probably contributes 0.001% to the carbon, is facing disproportionate damage for actions of others, which is what brings up this whole issue of the loss and damage and compensation to enable these countries to get along at least. Your thoughts?
No, it's clear, as was the title of this session, we're all in this together. And we need to actually face the consequences together. And the answer to that is more multilateralism, because we need the forums, we need the places to make the decisions, and actually where we can take the different countries to account. So that's where we have the problem with the debate. Is as we look at the multilateral organs, the vehicles to achieve these goals, but if you undermine them, we will get worse, and it will not. And the imbalance is there, but we don't have other mechanisms to actually balance them out. And then we'll continue to actually to nag and nag and nag on this. We probably will not get where everybody contributes what's necessary or what's or actually what's fair. But we need to keep working that way.
You wanted to say something?
No, just on the loss and damage. Unfortunately, as he rightly points out, we need multilateral agreements on it, but it has always been elusive on loss and damage. The mechanisms have not been as effective as it should be because, the commitment has not been forthcoming.
Ambassador Sharp, let me ask you to leave your UN hat aside for a second and wear your American hat, right? You contribute 25%, right? Do you see, it's something that the Prime Minister said in Glasgow about the need to change our lifestyle and make it more sustainable. Now, I've lived in Washington, and it's almost like every American thinks it's a fundamental human right to live in 20-21 degree ambient temperature, whether it's summer or winter, regardless of the amount of fuel that is needed to keep you cool or warm to 20-21 degrees. Do you see any changes coming in lifestyle, any willingness to maybe meet an iota of make an iota of the sacrifice so that the world can be a safer place?
Thank you for that very, very easy question. And I do have to reiterate that I'm not US government, United Nations. But anyway, as a citizen, you asked, and in fact, I know my good friend Patricia, the US Chargé d'Affaires, is speaking, I think, on a panel here shortly. But I think the problem is that, first of all, this is climate change is the sort of it's the public policy nightmare because we've seen it as being such a long-term issue, right? But most often public policy is determined and people are making their decisions based on short-term views. Now, the importance of the multilateral kind of communications, the IPC, the science, is to demonstrate both, of course, long-term impacts, but to show that this is impacting all of us today. We're all in this boat together. Absolutely. Our private consumption is creating negative externalities for others, but also, for ourselves. The problem is that people have very short memories. So I remember, for example, in the US, and this shows the vulnerability of dependence on, carbon for fuel, on oil. We see what's happening now in Ukraine. I mean, this horrible, senseless invasion. Obviously, most importantly, is the tragic loss of lives. In addition to that, we're seeing immediately how the price of oil is going up, impacting currencies, impacting the livelihoods of people across the world, including India. So when this has happened in the past, people change behaviors in the high-income countries, change behaviors, US being particularly bad when it comes to per capita consumption. They start buying more fuel-efficient vehicles. They start, turning off lights more, doing things like that. Then as soon as the price of oil goes, down, they kind of forget about it. They start buying the big vehicles again. So I hate to say that, no, I don't. I mean, definitely there are many people changing their lifestyles in the US and in the high-income countries, but nowhere near enough to make a difference, to make an impact. And that's where the multilateralism is important because it also holds them accountable. It's a collective responsibility.
Ambassador Puri, let me ambush you with a surprise question. I was reading a report that climate change impacts the poorest and the most vulnerable disproportionately.
Mm-hmm.
And in that are women,
Women.
particularly in developing countries. You've been Deputy Secretary General of UN Women. What do you think can be done, particularly to ameliorate some of the adverse climate change consequences on women?
Well, I don't think you have ambushed me because that's something I've been advocating for the last 10 years every time I attend and we made sure that in the Paris Climate Accord, there is specific provision and a specific gender lens on how climate action should be gender responsive and address both the concerns and interests of women, but also use their agency. So these are the two sides to it. Women are, as you said, especially poor women, are disproportionately affected by climate change, extreme weather events, by droughts, by flooding, by food. There is an impact on food security, agriculture. There is an impact on fuel. There is this picture of women and girls walking miles to gather fuel or to get water. So these impacts are vividly before our eyes. So the answer is, of course, to empower them so that they can be agents of climate mitigation and adaptation. So, so that's what we were doing in the UN, and both with other agencies as well as UN Women, that we were doing a number of programs where women were involved in adaptation and mitigation projects.
You think the step to provide gas, for example, is a specific step that helps women in that direction?
Ujjwala, of course, and that's one of the examples that was given by the Prime Minister in Glasgow as well, that by easing their life and making available clean cooking fuel, they were ameliorating the impacts of climate change in this way, where women had to walk miles to gather fuel. So there are many aspects where public policy and special welfare schemes, interventions, policy interventions can help us. And also the water Amrit scheme. There are many other schemes that are also very much targeted towards that.
So let me open up the floor for questions. The lady in green, please direct your question to one of the panelists who you think is most relevant. Yes, the lady here. Can we get a mic to her?
Hi, this is Sahiti here, and my question is for Lakshmi. And so you all mentioned that you talked about climate finance, developmental loans, and also the important sectors being impacted by climate change effort. I would also like to know your view on how much tracking and transparency is there in the financial transactions and deals happening underneath, because this is all policy that you have discussed, but eventually it's all trade, right? Like what is the amount of transparency that is there in the investment banking deals and alternative investments related to sustainability, climate impact, more to say ESG?
And I think it's a very good point, because one of the issues that we are really dealing with as ESG becomes popular is greenwashing. And that's become a reality of our times. But
I don't think that there is that kind of transparency. That kind of tracking should happen. I know that I think you can also address that, because the UN is trying to be in a way, a monitoring body to see what the private sector is doing. What is private finance doing in this area? I know that UNDP has entered into agreements with a number of major financial companies and investment banks. And there is an attempt to track that. But you are absolutely right. There is need to have mechanisms within countries and multilaterally to track this very important source of and flow of climate finance. But in addition, I think there is a climate finance mechanism of the UN, and perhaps you might like to talk about that.
Sure. No, very good question. I mean, I think this is looking at two sides of the same coin. I mean, one is, how can we quality assure claims of green financing in the private sector, innovative financing for the SDGs. This is it's a big area that's emerged in the last, sort of 15 years, let's say, and also to create avenues to kind of crowd in private investment towards these goals that we have. Climate change and the other SDGs is really important. So we're supporting a number of different types of vehicles. Green bonds, for example, is one. We're also looking at, we're hoping to support gender bonds and, how to really bring the three together, investment finance, government targeting and prioritization. And then, of course, the technical assistance to help to provide that, quality assurance that, in fact, financing is going for these for targets for SDGs and other targets.
So let me just add that ESG is becoming fashionable.
Yeah.
There's money coming in, but companies are also using the ESG window for greenwashing and making claims that they are putting money into green finance, whereas actually it is not. And there are enough documented examples that I think the next step for the organizations like UN is to evolve the standards so that there's a clear test of what is green finance. But let me, yes, sir.
Am I audible? Yeah. Hello, sir. Good afternoon. This is Yash from Diplomats Lab. I'll come to my question, citing few instances. Yeah, sure. So basically, Japan exiting the International Whaling Commission, then as you cited of hypocrisy of climate change, wherein the nations like US first exited the Paris Agreement and then rejoining, and for the Kyoto Protocol, the phase 2 being ratified as late as last year. So, what's the way forward, as in how to make it legally binding exactly for the nations to go about? Because the climate change is here, because we cannot address things at a later stage and and play a blame game.
Great question. Let me take one more from here.
A very good afternoon to the esteemed panel. My question is that Greta Thunberg has been a beacon of change. She has put the youngsters on the stage and the platform of the policymakers. I want to know from both Lakshmi ma'am and Sharp sir that how you are involving youth, or how you see the youth getting involved in the question of climate change and in the policy involvement related to the climate change. Thank you.
We'll start with you and then come to Ambassador Sharp, and if Ambassador Frydenlund wants to add anything.
Let me answer, because I think your question about legally binding, I would leave to Mr. Sharp to answer. But about youth, that's vital, because any transformation, and for a country like India in particular, which is youth rich and abundant, we need to have youth not only aware, but ignited with this cause and driving this cause. And I think that's very much the intention of the government. And I'm not speaking for government, but I can see that there is a big involvement of youth in all these projects, and youth entrepreneurship, green jobs, green education. I think these are key areas in which youth can be, and also movement building, advocacy and movement building. And sometimes the older generation, the behavior change that you were talking about, Navdeep, even in India, we are, as we evolve developmentally, we try to ape the lifestyles of the West, the non-sustainable or unsustainable lifestyles of the West. So how can youth make that difference and show the older generations that this is not sustainable? And many young people are doing that, whether it is plastics, the whole campaign on plastics, on many other things.
Let me just ask Ambassador Sharp to quickly come in, because I realize that we're running
Sure.
against the clock.
Sure. So, I mean, first of all, we have what we have, and at this present point, what we have is peer pressure. So, I mean, countries are making voluntary commitments. It's not enforced like some sort of a treaty level and with penalties and things like that. But what we do have is very powerful. So we need to keep pushing forward with that. It's the peer pressure, everybody seeing each other, making commitments. We know in psychology, peer pressure is actually the strongest of the emotional levers, let's say. In terms of the youth, absolutely. And I think, the good news is that you mentioned Greta, for example, look what one, teenager in one small town in one country was able to do. How in the world did that help it? Yeah, I mean, no matter what, some people have different opinions of it, but I think it was absolutely incredible. How did that one person make a global impact? And a big part of that story is, of course, we live in the world of social media. This connectivity is incredible. And so my message to youth is never before have young people been more empowered to make a difference. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter what you're doing. You can really, really make a difference. Secondly, I think that, here in India, this is, wow. I mean, what a topic. We're at the beginning of a demographic transition over the next 20, 25 years, which with the right nurturing and policies in place will be an amazing demographic dividend. Can really, be like a turbo charge for India. But a big part of that requires creating jobs. And this is where we see the link with the green transition that's been mentioned. Investing in green jobs, investment in green transition economy creates 3 times more jobs than in, carbon-based economy. So that's really what the answer is. And then finally, I just want to say, for example, the Prime Minister has launched this campaign Life, which is exactly looking at, we need a revolution in the way that people change the behaviors. Each one of us at home, the small things we do, 1.3+ billion people making small changes each is a phenomenal change. I mean, you can't imagine that change. And I had the opportunity just yesterday to go visit here in Rajasthan, to go to the Barefoot College about an hour outside of Jaipur, and to see this amazing thread across all of these topics here. Older women in communities who didn't have the advantage of a formal education and graduate certificates and things, being taught how to become engineers, photovoltaic solar power engineers, and empowering their communities to spread solar energy, which is the greatest natural resource of Rajasthan. I mean, just look, we have so much sun here. So it was really a powerful story.
Thank you very much. I know we are out of time. A big thank you to our wonderful panelists, and keep that passion alive for climate change. Oh, okay. We have one online question which we have to take.
Yes, so this is from Deepika. She says, my question is, how great is the concept of carbon taxing? Because it's obviously the huge industries and giants responsible for the majority of the problem, rather than the individuals we ask to stop using cars, plant more trees. Big corporates and entire nations should be taxed based on how much carbon they're responsible for emitting, because isn't money always what motivates the most? They'd probably even work on lowering their carbon footprints to avoid having to pay taxes.
Ambassador Frydenlund, why didn't you take that on carbon taxes?
No, actually, carbon taxes is an extremely important tool in this, because we need to use less carbon, and when we use less of it, it needs to cost more. And therefore, we need carbon taxes. We need it quite a large scale. That's to say. Just one comment to the issue of greenwashing, which is a problem, but actually it's a silver lining. There's greenwashing because people are concerned about environment. So we need to use that momentum to move forward on green investment.
I think Ambassador Puri wants
I
to
want
add.
to say something on this whole issue of carbon taxing. It's one thing for us to impose some taxes or penalties for using carbon emitting technologies or industries or agricultural methods, which in democracies is always very difficult, as we all know. And on the other hand, to put border taxes, for example, the European Union is considering this CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism, which will tax imports which have a certain higher constant emission emission quotient. And it will affect some 6 different industries, including iron and steel, cement, energy, and so on. And that, is the wrong kind of tax, because it penalizes developing countries who are seeking a just transition and who are not being able to have the necessary resources to make that just transition. So I think I just want to make that point about carbon taxes and carbon taxes.
Absolutely. Excellent. And thank you very much. Again, big shout out for our wonderful panel. Thank you.
We would like to thank His Excellency Hans Frydenlund.